Okay, so as Thomas said, my name is Fran Murphy, and I head up the sort of contractual arm of Dyfed Archaeological Trust. And the project I'm going to talk about today is a piece of commercial work. So this is developer-funded work that sits within what we call the planning process. So this is a piece of the work that we're undertaking here is very different from some of the other pieces you've heard, the projects you've heard talk about. This is in reaction to a proposal to develop a site that sits within the planning process. So we are in Haverfordwest, and it's amazing because normally most of the talks we give are in this area of Southwest Wales, and I gave one recently which was outside of this area, and I presumed that they all knew where Haverfordwest was, and they didn't. And I realised I didn't have a location map. But anyway, here we are, but everyone knows where we are in Haverfordwest. And just to put it into context, this is an aerial photograph taken in the 1980s of the castle and showing the western Cleddau. And in the little map by this extract by the side, you can see that the castle and the priory, the Augustinian priory of St. Mary and St. Thomas are circled. Now, they're two big upstanding medieval monuments in Haverfordwest. They're quite visible, they're clearly, their function is, we can understand their function. But if you were asked what was between those in the medieval period, you would have a little bit more difficulty. There is very little surviving above ground in Haverfordwest of any of the medieval layout. There are some indications, but really, we don't really know where the walls were. So, even though we know a lot, there are big gaps in our knowledge. And we know that Haverfordwest was founded in the early 12th century allegedly by Tancred, a Flemish settler, during the Anglo-Norman conquest of southwest Wales. And a little town called Castleton developed around the castle. But that town quickly grew. And if you like, you can imagine the town growing between these two big monuments here. Now, the site that we were concerned with is this one here, and it's the old Ocky White Store, which many of you may well remember, which was in use for over 100 years. And this site, once the store closed, was bought by Pembrokeshire County Council. And there's the old Ocky White Store standing there. And Pembrokeshire County Council were very, very successful in obtaining European funding for to help redevelop parts of Haverfordwest. And as part of that redevelopment, they bought the store and bought this area close to the riverside as part of their redevelopment plans. Now, when they do this, when a developer, whoever they may be, first buys a site, they have to, obviously they design plans for what they want to build, and they have to put them into the planning process. They have to put an application in to acquire planning approval. And to do this, they had to, in this case, accompany it with what's called a desk space assessment, which we completed. And this raised the potential, it looks at the potential, if you like, of the impacts, what the impacts of this development will be upon the historic environment, including any below ground remains. So when we looked at the history of this area, if we are working back in time from the present day, the first thing that the first major sort of occupation of this site is the Mary Church Foundry, which was founded during the late 1800s. And it was, the foundry was known, is a very well-known foundry. It's actually founded by Solomon Mary Church. Mary Church is his surname, very strange surname. And it flourished and produced many items, and perhaps the railings that you see, for example, many of the railings you see in Haverfordwest will have been made here. And that's another view of the foundry. And I love this old postcard because it shows just how underdeveloped, I have to remember my east and my west, the east side of the Western Cleddau in this area was in the 1950s until very recently. And in the background you see the old bridge. And on your left-hand side you will see the Mary Church foundry sitting right up against the ridge. This is before the weir was inserted. So as well as that knowledge of this in the industrial, if you like, history of this area, and here you can see the Cleddau ironworks marked on the 1889 Ordnance Survey map of Haverfordwest. There's also what predated that. And there are little hints in just this map itself. For example, a bit of a giveaway here, Convent of Blackfriars, site of. And other little hints, with now the Friars Pub, or in the place where the Black Horse Hotel was, or the Hole in the Wall Lane, where supposedly, allegedly, the friars of St. Saviour's Friary, which is a friary we're going to talk about today, passed alms or passed food to the poor from a hole in the wall of perhaps of the precinct, the monastic precinct. So all these, the Black Friars, we're now talking about the Dominicans, named so because of the black robes they wore. So when we prepare these desk-based assessments, we're looking at all the evidence that we have of what might indicate what the buried archaeology in this area might be. Now, so we come to the subject of this, which is St. Saviour's Friary. Now, all these are hinting at a friary that we know existed, but we've never been, even apart from this evidence, clearly sure where the precinct, if you like, might be. There are further references to it in post-dissolution. It was bought by the Barlow family, and the Barlow family owned it right up into the 19th century. And there are references in the record office of leases and tenancies which clearly indicate that the Barlow owned the land called Friars, always the land of the Friars or Friars' land. But the difficulty when you're trying to explain to a developer is what that potential might be. And because, if I just go back, there has been no comparable development in this area in Haverfordwest. There's nothing directly to say, if you do this, you will find this, and this is what the risk is. But it's very clear that there was potential for hitting buried medieval remains, as well as earlier industrial remains, and equally anything predating the friary. So just to skip on, I know that's a quick whiz through, and just talk a little bit about the Dominicans. Now, the Dominicans are a mendicant order. They were completely dependent on alms. And they established in the mid-13th century 5 houses in Wales, somewhat dividing up those main urban centres which they required to provide enough alms to support them, with perhaps the Franciscans. For example, the Franciscans had Carmarthen, the Dominicans had Haverfordwest. Cardiff could support both Franciscans and Dominicans. So as a mendicant order, they needed to live in an urban setting to give them that support, that financial support, to allow them to build their monastic houses and for the running and to support their preaching. because they were a great preaching order. Now, the Dominican Friary of St. Saviour's, we have no map evidence for. So I can't show you what it would look like. I can't show you exactly where it was. But we do have, for the over 300 years that it existed, something like 16 documentary records, all to do with grants and alms and bequests. So we know that by 1246 they were established in Haverfordwest. We don't know when they first arrived. We have a clear record that in 1256, the money they were granted allowed them to expand, or the translation is to move to a better place. In 1291, Queen Eleanor of Castile, who was a huge supporter of the Dominicans, granted the 5 Dominican houses a substantial amount of money. And St. Saviour's reputedly became quite a point of pilgrimage. So all that's very interesting, but how does that lead us to where we came now, to where we came to? Well, the difficulty is that often when we're asked to do for something like a desk-based assessment that supports that planning application, is once we've submitted it, we don't have, as a contractor, we don't have anything more to do with what happens to that planning process and development. And it's only at a later date when we're approached to give costs for doing further work, do we know and find out that it has been granted planning permission with conditions. And one of those conditions is a very general archaeological one. So this is that the archaeology should be mitigated against, and that is a process which is always undergoing constant negotiation, renegotiation with the client and with the archaeological advisor to the planning authority. So when we come on, the first time we come onto site, the site looks like this. This is when most of the material has been stripped out. And the first thing they hit that influences developments is the sheer amount of asbestos in the site. Huge amounts everywhere. Obviously, that takes precedence over anything, and that has to be removed. Then we're asked if we could look at a few pits, geotechnical pits, that now the main contractor is on site. They need to design the foundations of the building. Now we're right next to the river Western Cleddau. We're in the riverine silts and sands. Engineers hate these soils. They don't see them as being particularly structurally sound, so we have to, the engineers come, they excavate quite large pits to look at the below ground conditions so they can design their foundations. And as part of that process, we're asked to come and monitor them to see what else we can see in this archaeologically, whether there's anything that we can see. And my colleague Andrew went out and he very quickly phoned in and said, I think we have got a lot of archaeology, Fran, and some of it, I don't know if you can see right at the bottom of that 2-meter scale, are some little paler areas, and they are human bone. So he recorded all the pits, and it was very clear that we had quite deeply stratified archaeology and indications of possible burials. We then come in to evaluate the site to ascertain the levels at which the archaeology first appears, and what you can see in this is a trench that we excavated showing that we very quickly come onto the remains, unsurprisingly, of the foundry. Once this information is in place, we go through quite a long period with the client, who is Pembrokeshire County Council in this, and the planning authority itself, which is under the same umbrella, and their archaeological advisor, and ourselves on what is the next stage and how much it will cost. Now, because of the instability of the ground conditions, the only way that they could build the foundations for a new building in this site was through piling, an extremely deep piling. So these are concrete piles driven into the ground, and some of them were going to be 6 or 7 meters deep. So, if you like, a raft of piles. Now, it was clear that piling, that foundation method, which was the only one they felt was appropriate, would destroy all below-ground archaeology. And so we were instructed that the only way forward was total excavation before development. So but as I will say, all these things are a compromise and a matter of constant negotiation. And so when we come onto site on November 21, this is what is presented with us. And like all urban sites, it looks a terrible mess. And you can see that we've got a very thin, narrow development area between existing buildings. And they were never very clear how stable some of those buildings would be. And so we used to have monitors on the walls to ascertain whether they were shaking at all. And they did have to do some underpinning before we could continue with work. But just so you know where we are, this is the development area, and that picture I just showed you was looking towards Bridge Street, so looking roughly, let's say, west, along that zone A1 and A3. And in our negotiations, with the planning archaeological advisor to the LPA, decided that Zone B we would do no work in because it was really precluded because of the amount of asbestos in the ground. Zone C didn't seem to have a huge amount of archaeology in it, and if we excavated Zone C, we would halt development completely. And so to allow the development to progress to some degree without it coming to complete halt, the agreement was that we would excavate zones A2, A1 and A3 in their entirety, which would allow the development to move around from zone B to zone C through to zone A2 and then into A1 and A3 behind us. So literally they were coming behind us as soon as we completed our work. So this is what it looks like when we first get onto site. Andrew, my colleague, watching the machine. And what you can see is the huge amount of foundry waste that has been used in the past to level the site. And if we can, we remove those probably non-significant materials off with machine because it takes so long otherwise, until we get down to some more interesting deposits. And this is what survives really of the foundry casting pits. And so, not the most stunning of archaeology, but interesting in itself. But what was interesting, to see I like going back in time a bit further, is that underneath those casting, that foundry waste, if you like, please don't look at the angle of that wheelbarrow on the side. It was actually quite safe, but it looks terrible in that photograph. What we found was a series of graves and containing east-west aligned skeletons, most of which appear to be shroud burials. So, and here you can see a few more that we found. And to the side, that's the edge of a casting pit just coming in. And you can see we've got quite a lot of intercutting burials in a small area, about 17 in quite a small area. And they're cutting those naturally deposited river gravels. And this is one gentleman, I always call him gentleman because I don't know if they're male or female, who has lost quite a lot of himself to a casting pit. So that was quite an easy bit of the excavation. It went quite quickly. Once we removed those human remains, those skeletons, then we really had nothing left to do in that area. There didn't seem to be any other earlier features. There was no evidence of buildings. And so we were sort of pleasantly surprised, thought, this will go quickly. And then we moved, they wanted us off there as quickly as possible, which we did, and we came on to A1 and A3. And again, this is what it looks like when we start. Always looks a terrible mess. Takes us ages to clear up. And what we started coming down to was the remains of a huge network of post-medieval drains. It was like the spaghetti junction of drainage, draining into cisterns. We think an incredibly deep cistern, the square one you see in the middle there. We used the mini digger to excavate it, and we couldn't get to the bottom of it with the length of the arm. It was so amazingly deep cisterns, which we think are holding fresh water for the iron foundry. The Western Cleddau being tidal would have been too salty for the iron foundry, and they're collecting water on quite a substantial scale. That is what you see. That picture there is just one level of the drains. There was another level on top. But what interested me most was that some of the material that they cobbled together to create these drains was actually worked stone, shaped stone, worked stone from window surrounds, archways, and that must have come from somewhere. So at the moment, what we're seeing here is lots of post-medieval industrial activity, but hints that they're reusing material from older buildings. Now, when you clear all that modern activity away, I say modern, post-medieval activity away, and what you get is these series of, you can see where long drains run down the middle of the site and a pit. These are all modern features. We excavate them all. And what we're doing is we're sort of, as has been spoken about in earlier talks, going backwards in time from the top through to earlier periods. And what was interesting was this area here, which was just demolition material. Masses of stone and tile and pottery. Well, actually not a lot of pottery, a huge amount of tile, roof tile, that's what I was going to say. Roof tile, floor tile. And it was thicker to the southern edge. So the southern edge is to the left. And if you can imagine, it sort of tapered downwards to the north, as though it had been thrown over from the south, and was therefore, that was where it was denser, and then tapered away to the north. And that material was full of things like carved stone. You can see a little arm from a tomb perhaps, and some dressed stone with a little angel, and an enormous amount of floor tile, encaustic floor tile. Now, I've said early 13th century for them, I think we're thinking it's a little bit later now. But, so it couldn't have come from anywhere else other than a church. And so we thought, wow, is the Friary Church to the south? Where are we then in relation to it? But again, no real hints of any structures associated with this deposit. But when we took all that material off, when we cleaned it all up, what we came down to was this very consistent, brown, silty, dirty soil that you can see across the site. And ignoring that square cistern in the centre, which is much later, you can see the remnants of a wall running east-west on the northern side of the site, which has been reduced right down to its very foundations. And equally, in the background, you see some little bits of walling sticking up. And in the far background, you can see how quickly they moved into the area of A2 after we'd left it. By this point, we are now completely enclosed, and our only access to the site is through Bridge Street, a door in to the front of the building, or everything has to be craned over into the site. So it's getting tricky. So that picture that I took earlier, this is taken at the same time, and you can see this nice consistent brown soil, and you can see this very large wall that survives to a much greater height than the one I showed you on the north. And this site runs parallel with, this wall runs parallel with Bridge Street. It's a substantial thing, and it runs under the existing walls of both buildings either side. And the engineer said, I think that one of the reasons those walls are still standing is because they're sitting on this. But what is interesting, what you might have noticed, is that you can see the skulls poking through the soil now. A series of burials, pretty obvious coming to the surface. We had at this stage excavated a few, particularly along the northern edge. And you can see in the far bottom corner, the right-hand corner, someone's feet just sticking out. But at this stage, we had to stop, because unlike in the advantages of digging in Wogan's cavern, this is all really unstable. We are now at 1.2 metres below ground level and cannot excavate further without shoring. And shoring is expensive. So we had a choice: either we stop now and we allow it to be destroyed, or to enable us to excavate deeper, the sides had to be shored. And this was a major undertaking. So, as I said before, by now, you can see in the far background, that building is built to at least to first floor level. So the only way to gain access into this site is now to bring any materials in that are larger than can get through a normal door is by crane. So after coming to some agreement with a temporary works engineer on how we should do this, a machine is craned in, and an area of sand, quite a depth of sand, is put across the site, and then they pummel in these what we call sheet piles to either side to allow us, which are then, you see these whalers in between these huge metal supports to push against each side to hold it rigid of the sheet piling. In that way, it remains a stable structure and won't affect the walls either side. There's always a compromise. We've reduced our area again somewhat, but it allows us to excavate to a far deeper level. So after we've removed all that sand, we can get going. As you can see, it's a little bit restrictive, and it gets more restrictive as you go down, because those horizontal bars you see going across, they're fine when you're at a certain level, you can climb over them. You excavate a metre down, and no one's legs, apart from Andrew's, were long enough to get over them, so everyone had to crawl under them. So it's a tricky excavation, but what was very clearly apparent was the number of burials we had. So you can see that wall, that big substantial wall that I said had survived some height, and you can see the burials that placed right up against it. Now we had in all about over 320 burials in this quite a small area, so densely populated burial ground over some hundreds of years, we think. And it's, we think these aren't monks, these are the people from Haverfordwest. So they're females, males, females, old, young, tiny babies, and reflect the whole of the local population of Haverfordwest, who wished to be buried near St. Saviour's Friary Church. They'd be on the north side of the church. Ooh. I can't really express enough how many burials there were in a small area and how difficult they were to excavate, how difficult it was to maneuver yourself around the site, and the staff did an amazing job in recording them so well. There were so many intercutting burials over such a long period of time that there was a huge amount what we call disarticulated bone. So if you can imagine, some of the burials had the skeletons had stayed in situ, unaffected by later burials, but in excavating new burials where they dislodged huge amounts of bone from previous burials, and then they didn't know what to do with that, so sometimes they put it back in the grave, sometimes they just threw it to the side. And some of that disarticulated bone had some of the most obvious what we call pathology. And you can see these two skulls, both with little holes drilled into their skulls. We don't think they're actually puncture wounds because there are no fractures in the skull itself. And we think they're possibly the result of trepanning. There was one group we had on the west side of that big wall, which was completely different. Now, these were 11 burials which had been stacked in coffins. And these were all adults. I don't know if they're all men, but I think these are the most likely to be monks. We have, being a Christian burial site, being a Christian cemetery, there are very few grave goods. You can't take it into the next life. But occasionally there was something thrown back in. And this poor person has got a water bucket handle on the top of his head, and actually someone's pelvis by the side of his shoulder, which shouldn't be there. But that just shows exactly how the design, how clearly that design is. This is a 15th century holy water bucket. I can't remember the Latin name for it. That comes from the V&A. And this design is still used today. Oops. When we're excavating so many remains of humans, it is very easy to become a bit laissez-faire about it all. And occasionally, more than occasionally, there was a salutary reminder of that these were the very personal remains of individuals who had lived and had families, worked and died. And this shows an adult. The skull that you see is actually the child's skull. The adult skull is underneath. But you can see the little legs and the crossed hands of the child, crossed arms, sorry. And above it were the arms of the adult, and they'd been buried together. And it was just a salutary reminder of our own mortality and how these were real people. And as often in archaeology, we can get very tied up with artifacts. And the amazing thing about excavating the skeletons is that these are unique to each individual, just a pure reflection of that person. Some group burials were grouped together, suggesting they were possibly from a family. I have to say the person at the bottom was very poorly and had terrible syphilis. So you remember all that lovely encaustic tile we saw at the beginning in that deposit which sat above the cemetery. But when we got lower into the cemetery soils, we started finding evidence of a very different tile, much more cruder. And this one, we believe, is a symbol from the local Picton family. And some of those encaustic tiles we found in that later deposit are now thought to be mostly from a lot of families from Monmouthshire. So we have this nice distinction in that the earlier material is much more local, and the later tile that we found is from a more diverse number of families. just to show you how big the foundations and wide those foundations of that wall on the east side, on the west side, parallel with somewhat parallel with Bridge Street. And it had been rebuilt several times, at least 2, possibly 3 times in its lifetime. It was super huge. Now, at the east end of the site, as opposed to where that wall you've just seen, right at the bottom, so we had, if you can imagine, there are about 3 layers of burials, 4 layers of burials to excavate. And what we get down to when we start at the eastern end is we start finding that little bits of walling that poked out from the ground are crypts. And some of those are partially destroyed by later burials, but as you can see here, a sequence of burials cutting through each other and the wall of an earlier crypt. And this just shows you we're now at the bottom, we're at the eastern end of the site. And what we have running down the north side is that remnant of north wall. And then at this eastern end, you can see the rectangular cuts for the crypts, some of which got little bits of walling still being retained. And if we've got crypts and we're at the east end of what we think must be a church, so what I'm suggesting is that we have in front of us an early St. Saviour's Friary church, which has at some stage of its life, perhaps when they had the money to move to a better place to expand, eventually becomes redundant and is levelled, and a church to the south is built. And at that east end was one of our most interesting burials, and right in the northeast corner, in a coffin, so right by the high altar of the church, was a person buried with what we believe is a heart box, a lead heart box. And this is the only one I've ever excavated. There are examples elsewhere. And in the medieval period, it wasn't unknown. In fact, to divide the body up, particularly if you're an extremely important person, and distribute your body around different ecclesiastical churches, so that really for the enrichment of funds for the church or monastery. And equally in the Crusades, your body, if you died, your body couldn't be shipped home, but your heart could be sealed, embalmed, often, and is sealed in a heart box, lead heart box, to come back. And sometimes even shrines are built to that returned heart. This one was found in Cork, and the embalmed heart still survived inside. But this one, unfortunately, was extremely crushed over the years of its being in the ground, and is being conserved at the National Museum. What is interesting is that lid, if you like, which has been pressed into the box. On the underside of it, we can just see it's decorated. So not on the upper side, but on the inside. But at the moment, they're having difficulties in taking it apart without it shattering. What is interesting, I keep saying this, what is interesting, but this is a man, and weirdly, the bone is now being analysed at Cardiff University. They couldn't determine the sex. But we are having some DNA analysis. The Crick Institute in London is analysing about 120 of the skeletons for DNA analysis, and they just carried out a little sample to see whether they think the results would be good. And this person was one of them, just happened to be, and it's a man. So it's definitely a man, and whoever heart that was must have been someone very dear to them. Now, just by that grave, if you like, we found in the last week, you have to remember we were right by the river. We'd had a fantastic dry year for digging, and it was so good because being right with the river, water entering the site we thought was always going to be a problem, but it hadn't. We got away with it until the last month of 2022 when the heavens opened and the water level started rising. As it was, we just managed to get the excavation as complete as we could, but we found that north wall is on the left-hand side, and that is the return of the wall. So that has helped us understand the structure, and so that is the eastern wall of the church. So that's what I'm suggesting we have in our small area, is that what you can see, that big chunky wall on the west end near Bridge Street is, I think, is a rebuild of I'm suggesting it is the rebuild of what would have been the west wall of the church, making it quite a modest sort of about 26 metres long. And these are our crypt burials. These are just plans in the process of being produced, so there are a few things wrong with them, but just to show you, those are our crypt burials. These are our earliest burials, and those are our middle burials. And Ken made a suggestion that this masonry we found at the eastern end, which all these burials respect, it could be part of the altar at the eastern end. And what is interesting is now that we've planned them all, because we never had this overall plan, because we had such smaller plans that had to all be knitted together, what is interesting is that a lot of these later burials, when we're sure that the church is being demolished, still respect the walls of that earlier church. Now, whether they were somewhat prominent at this stage, but so they were burying them inside that old perimeter, that old boundary of the church, or because when we get into the next phase of burials, they start actually lying across the walls. So were the walls not visible? Anyway, this is something we're starting to think about, and it isn't until we compile all these plans, we compile them and see them as a whole, that we start to visualize and start to think about how more clearly they were developed over time. And just as an example of what happens elsewhere, this is Norwich, and this is the Norwich Blackfriars. And you can see a very similar story there. You can see that little 13th century church, quite small, and over time, when they acquired the funds to do so, they expand, and that east wall becomes part of the cloistral arrangement, and that big chunky Dominican church gets built to the south. They have the nave has no side transepts because they wanted to get as many people in there to hear their preaching as possible. I did say that we don't have many finds from a burial site. I mean, we had huge amounts of building material from a monastic church, but what we didn't have was many individual little personal finds. And one of our many volunteers who worked on cleaning the bone spotted this little encrusted attached to a finger bone. It's a middle phalange from a finger, and a little tiny bit of gold sticking out. And I took it to the National Museum in Cardiff, and they x-rayed it, and it's a little belt ring. And then that x-ray, the bright white, is beautiful gold, and you can see where the buckle is, where the little belt of the belt ring would go, and the incrustation is copper and iron. So it was somebody's personal ring left on their finger. So that's what it looked like at the end, after about 7 months. the water table started to rise, and there isn't a great deal more we can do at this stage. We did have some earlier features. We had a number of pits, a number of and kilns, or remnants of kilns. But and to be perfectly honest, I'd love to have gone further if there had been the opportunity. But the practicalities of doing anything further at this site were just hugely the fine. It would have cost a lot of money, more than it already did cost. And as Geraint is here, and I think Geraint was involved in finding this on the penultimate day, when digging a sump. And this, as all things, just at the last, just when you least expect it, we found something which is so rare, and the only one found in Wales, a small jet chess piece. It is about that big, a couple of 3 inches high, made, we think, from Whitby jet. It's at the National Museum at the moment, being studied, and it's actually a bishop. It represents a bishop. And its date, well, I've been given every date, I think, from about the 10th to the 14th. And it was sitting beneath a grave. It was sitting beneath one of those crypts, beneath the wall, a lower level to the wall of one of the crypts that was surviving. And Geraint was digging a sump to allow another to, so that we could drain a bit of water away, so we could excavate a skeleton. And it's just such a beautiful tactile thing. And it was always our hope that we would dig a little bit more in that area. But unfortunately, the water kept rising, and it was there was nowhere to take water to. We couldn't pump out anywhere. So we had to give up. So if there's the rest of the chess piece, chess set, it's still down there. So I think there's some of the people in this picture here today. One of the things, when you do these commercial projects, obviously we have to cost them. We have to cost them in money, time, and labour. And I've excavated on cemetery sites, but I've never costed a cemetery site. And I would cost it very differently if I did it again. And one thing I didn't really take account of was the sheer number of human bones there are in one skeleton. And if you replicate that by 320 plus all the disarticulated bone, you just have the most enormous pile. And what we were very fortunate is having a huge army of volunteers who came every day and sat in an old shop opposite this Ocky White Store on the other side of Bridge Street, which we commandeered and used as our finds processing centre and sort of drop-in, walk-in museum, social services sort of centre for everybody who lived in Haverfordwest. It was one of the best things we did, because we started using the windows as displays. Alex and Bethan here, who were in charge of the finds work, actively encouraged people to come in. People came off the street who had no idea of what we were doing. They were so engaged, and more and more people came to volunteer. And without them, I don't know what we would have done. You can see in the background, it was a sea of bags, and eventually made their way through nearly every bag, cleaning every single bone, looking for the little ossicles that come from the temporal bone in the ear for DNA analysis. They got really good at doing that. But that was I have to say, one of the most wonderful things about the site, because so rarely does the public get to see this side of it. They might see an excavation on an open day, but to drop in every day, see what we were doing, see what new finds there were, ask us how the excavation was going. And as one woman put to me, one lady, I didn't realise, she said, that all of this could be under my feet. And I said, yes, the whole history of Haverfordwest is under our feet. And I think it was a fantastic consequence of the work that we did there. So all credit to the volunteers and the staff. So really, that's where we are. We're at the very beginnings of all the analysis. Now we've carried out all this work. All the human skeletal remains are now with Cardiff University. Most of the finds, the tile are with the National Museum. The pottery has actually been already reported, as the first assessment's been done. And all the finds, samples, some of the bulk earth samples, which we hope to get some useful evidence from with Worcester Archaeology. So eventually all that information will start feeding back to us. And together with, when poor old Andrew, who supervised the work so brilliantly with Tom, gets an opportunity, I let him come back into the office because I keep sending him out on the next excavation. When he has time to sit down with us all, we will put all that information together and start building a story of how this site developed over time. What is interesting is I still can't definitively tell you where the friary buildings are, but I can tell you they're very close. And another thing I think is that I think we put off any next development in Bridge Street in this area for the foreseeable future. So I'd like to say thank you to all the people who worked on the site, worked so hard, and all the volunteers, and to weavers, the site contractors who were brilliant, and to Pembrokeshire County Council, who took it on and supported the project all the way. So thank you.